The afternoon sun glinted off the rows of expensive cars as James pulled his old sedan into the parking lot of Prestige Auto Gallery. At 42 years old, he'd worked hard his entire life and finally had the means to treat himself to something special. He'd been browsing their website for weeks, particularly interested in a sleek black luxury sedan that caught his eye. James wasn't one to dress up for every occasion. He'd just come from visiting his mother across town, so he wore comfortable jeans, a simple sweater, and his favorite sneakers. As he walked through the automatic glass doors into the gleaming showroom, the smell of new leather and polished floors hit him immediately. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the cars positioned throughout looked like pieces of art. He moved slowly through the showroom, admiring the craftsmanship of each vehicle. His fingers traced along the smooth hood of a silver sports car, and he peered through the window of a luxury SUV, imagining what it would feel like to drive something so refined. For years he'd driven practical, affordable cars. This would be different. This would be special. Within just a few minutes, a man in an expensive charcoal suit approached him. Richard was the director of sales, though James didn't know that yet. Everything about Richard screamed authority, from his slicked back hair to his polished Italian shoes. But the look on his face wasn't welcoming. His eyes traveled up and down, taking in James's casual outfit with barely hidden disapproval. "Can I help you?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he'd rather not. James smiled warmly, trying to ignore the cold reception. "Yes, actually. I've been looking at some of your models online, and I'd love to see that black sedan over there in person." Richard didn't move toward the car. Instead, he crossed his arms and tilted his head slightly. "That particular model starts at $120,000, he said slowly, as if speaking to a child. "Are you aware of our price range here?" The question hung in the air awkwardly. James felt his smile falter slightly, but he maintained his composure. "I am, yes. That's why I'm here." Richard let out a short laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Look, I think there might be some confusion. This is a luxury dealership. We cater to a very specific clientele." He paused, letting his words sink in. "There's a used car lot about 2 miles down the road. They have some nice, affordable options that might be more your speed." James felt heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I appreciate the suggestion, but I'm interested in purchasing from here. I've done my research, and I know exactly what I want." Other salespeople in the showroom were starting to notice the exchange. A younger salesman nearby looked uncomfortable, pretending to shuffle papers at his desk. A woman organizing brochures kept glancing over, her expression troubled. Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice but somehow making it sound even more condescending. "Listen, I've been in this business for 15 years. I can spot a serious buyer from a mile away. These cars require significant financial commitment, not to mention insurance, maintenance, the whole package." He gestured broadly at the showroom. "This isn't window shopping territory. We deal with doctors, lawyers, business executives, people who understand the caliber of what we offer here." "I understand perfectly," James replied, his patience wearing thin. "And I'm telling you, I'm interested in making a purchase." Richard's expression hardened. His voice rose slightly, loud enough that more people were turning to look. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We have a strict policy against loitering, and frankly, you're disrupting the experience for our legitimate customers." James looked around the showroom. There were only 2 other customers present, both browsing quietly on the other side of the space, paying no attention whatsoever. "I'm not loitering. I'm a potential customer trying to look at vehicles." "That's not what I'm seeing," Richard said firmly. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. "Tom, I need you in the main showroom, please." Within a minute, a security guard appeared from a side door. Tom was an older gentleman, probably in his late 50s, with kind eyes that looked decidedly uncomfortable with whatever he was being called to do. He approached slowly, clearly picking up on the tension. "Tom, please escort this gentleman out of the building," Richard commanded, gesturing toward James. "He's been asked to leave and is refusing." Tom looked between Richard and James, seeming to weigh the situation. James could see the conflict on the guard's face. This wasn't right, and Tom knew it. But Richard was his boss, the man who could make or break his employment. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me," Tom said quietly, apologetically. James stood there for a moment, anger and humiliation washing over him in waves. Everyone in the showroom was watching now. The two customers had stopped their browsing. The salespeople had abandoned any pretense of working. The silence was deafening. He could fight this. He could make a scene, demand to speak to someone higher up, threaten legal action. But something told him to wait. Sometimes the best response isn't immediate. "Fine," James said, his voice controlled despite the storm inside him. "I'll leave." He walked toward the exit with Tom trailing awkwardly behind him. As he passed through the glass doors, he turned back one last time. Richard stood in the center of the showroom, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face. He'd won, or so he thought. James got into his old sedan and sat there for several long minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel. His phone buzzed. Messages that needed responses. Meetings to schedule. Business to handle. Business that Richard knew nothing about. James took a deep breath, started his car, and drove away. The humiliation stung, but it also clarified something for him. He'd seen behind the curtain now, seen the truth of how this place really operated when no one was watching, and he had plans for what to do with that truth. 3 weeks earlier, James sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of a downtown office building. The city stretched out below him, looking peaceful from this height. But inside this room, one of the biggest moments of his life was unfolding. His attorney, Catherine, slid another document across the polished table. "Just 2 more signatures," she said with a smile. "Then Prestige Auto Gallery is officially yours." James picked up the expensive pen and signed his name with steady hands, even though his heart was racing. He'd built Williams Technology Solutions from nothing, starting in his tiny apartment 15 years ago with just a laptop and an idea. Now, after selling that company for more money than he'd ever imagined possible, he was entering a completely different world. The automotive industry had always fascinated him. As a kid, he'd spent hours watching his grandfather restore old cars in a cramped garage, learning about engines and craftsmanship. Now he had the resources to own a dealership, and Prestige Auto Gallery had caught his attention for all the right reasons. At least that's what he thought at the time. "Remember," James told Catherine as he pushed the signed papers back, "I don't want anyone knowing I'm the new owner yet." "Not the employees, not the customers, nobody." Catherine raised an eyebrow. "That's unusual. Most new owners want to make a splash right away." "I want to see how the place really runs," James explained. "When people know the owner is watching, they act differently. I need to understand the business from the ground up before I start making changes. Give me a few weeks to observe things quietly." The previous owner, George Sterling, had built Prestige Auto Gallery over 40 years. He was retiring now, his health wasn't what it used to be, and he wanted to travel with his wife while he still could. During their negotiations, George had spoken highly of his team, especially Richard. "Richard is the backbone of this operation," George had said during one of their meetings, his weathered hands gesturing enthusiastically. "He knows how to maintain standards, how to keep the dealership running at the highest level. You won't find a more dedicated director of sales anywhere." James had nodded along, making mental notes. The financial records looked solid. The dealership had a reputation for quality. Everything seemed straightforward. He'd planned to keep most of the staff, make gradual improvements, and build on the foundation George had established. But as James reviewed the paperwork over the following weeks, something started bothering him. He'd requested copies of customer feedback surveys and complaint records, wanting to understand what people really thought about their experience at Prestige Auto Gallery. That's when he noticed the pattern. Late one night in his home office, James spread out printed customer reviews across his desk. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as he pieced together a troubling picture. Several customers had left comments about feeling unwelcome. A black woman wrote about being followed around the showroom like she might steal something. A Hispanic family mentioned being steered toward the cheapest models despite expressing interest in luxury vehicles. One review stood out. A customer named David Chen had written a detailed account of visiting the dealership with his wife. Despite being a successful surgeon with excellent credit, they'd been treated with suspicion and dismissiveness. The review mentioned a sales director by name, Richard. James dug deeper, pulling up internal records that came with the acquisition. He found 3 formal complaints filed by employees about Richard's behavior toward minority customers over the past 18 months. One complaint came from a saleswoman named Monica, who'd objected to Richard turning away a qualified black customer. She'd been reassigned to administrative work shortly after filing her complaint. Another employee, a young man named Andre, had quit after witnessing Richard refuse service to a Middle Eastern businessman, claiming there were security concerns despite the man having an appointment and pre-approved financing. Andre's exit interview mentioned the incident specifically, stating he couldn't work somewhere that treated people that way. The complaints had been noted, but ultimately dismissed. George's handwritten comments in the margins said things like, "Richard knows our clientele and maintaining standards is important." James felt his stomach turn, reading those words. He pulled up sales data next, analyzing it by demographics. The numbers told an ugly story. While the city's population had become increasingly diverse over the past decade, Prestige Auto Gallery's customer base had actually narrowed. They were losing market share among emerging demographics while competitors across town were thriving. Richard's prejudice wasn't just morally wrong. It was costing the business money. Lots of money. James spent the next few days making quiet inquiries. He reached out to Monica directly, asking her to meet him at a coffee shop without explaining who he was at first. She arrived looking cautious, probably wondering why a stranger wanted to talk about her former workplace. Over coffee, James identified himself as someone conducting research on the dealership. Monica's story poured out. She talked about talented salespeople who'd left because they couldn't stomach the environment Richard created. She described how he'd cultivate relationships with wealthy clients while dismissing others without giving them a chance. She mentioned the subtle ways he'd discourage the team from spending time with certain customers. "I loved that job at first," Monica said, stirring her coffee absently. "I was good at it too. But watching people get treated differently because of how they looked, it wore me down. And when I spoke up, I got punished for it." She looked up at James with tired eyes. "I'm looking for work elsewhere now. I can't stay there anymore." James listened to every word, his resolve hardening with each story. He'd planned to take a gentle approach with his new business, making slow changes and keeping things stable. But this situation demanded something different. This required action. He thanked Monica for her honesty and promised her that things might be changing soon at Prestige Auto Gallery. She looked skeptical, probably having heard empty promises before. That was Friday afternoon. James spent the weekend preparing, gathering evidence and planning his approach. By Sunday night, he knew exactly what needed to happen. Monday morning would be different. Monday morning would change everything. He'd planned to observe the dealership quietly as a customer before his official introduction. That would still happen, just not quite the way he'd originally imagined. Sometimes you need to see the truth firsthand before you can fix what's broken. And James was about to get a very personal look at just how broken things had become. James sat in his car outside Prestige Auto Gallery for almost 20 minutes after being escorted out. His hands were still gripping the steering wheel, knuckles tight. He'd faced plenty of challenges building his business over the years, dealt with difficult clients and tough negotiations, but this felt different. This was personal in a way that cut deeper. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Catherine, his attorney, calling about some routine paperwork. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Hey, Catherine, what's up? Just checking in about the insurance documents for the dealership. Did you get a chance to look them over?" She paused. "You okay?" "You sound off," James let out a long breath. "I just got kicked out of my own dealership." There was silence on the other end, then Catherine's voice came back sharp and focused. "What happened? Tell me everything." He recounted the whole experience, from the moment Richard approached him to being escorted out by security. With each detail, he could hear Catherine's breathing get heavier with anger. "James, this is discrimination. Clear as day. We need to take immediate legal action. I can have papers filed by end of business today." "No," James said quietly. "Not yet." "What do you mean, not yet? This man humiliated you, violated your rights as a customer, and he doesn't even know he just did it to his new boss. We have grounds for a lawsuit that would make headlines." James stared at the dealership through his windshield. People were coming and going, normal business continuing like nothing had happened. A lawsuit won't fix what's broken there. It'll just make Richard a victim in his own mind, and nothing will actually change. "I need to handle this differently." Catherine sighed. "Okay, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I need to know exactly how deep this goes. Give me the weekend." Monday morning, we'll handle it properly." After hanging up, James drove back to his office. He had access to everything now. All the dealership's records, personnel files, sales data, security footage, everything. It was time to build a complete picture. He started with Richard's employment file, 15 years with the company, starting as a regular salesman and working his way up to director of sales. His numbers were impressive on paper, consistently high sales figures, good reviews from certain customers. But as James dug deeper, he noticed something interesting. Richard's sales were almost exclusively concentrated within one demographic: wealthy, older, predominantly white clients. That by itself wasn't necessarily damning. Salespeople often develop niches. But when James compared Richard's numbers to other top performers, the contrast was striking. The dealership's other successful salespeople had diverse client bases. Richard's was remarkably narrow. James pulled up the customer complaint database. Over the past 5 years, 7 formal complaints had been filed specifically about Richard's behavior. Most were dismissed with notes like "customer misunderstood" or "no evidence of wrongdoing." But reading them together, a clear pattern emerged. Every single complaint came from a person of color, describing similar experiences to what James had just gone through. One complaint from 2 years ago stood out. A woman named Patricia had written a detailed account of bringing her teenage son to look at cars for his graduation present. Richard had questioned whether they could afford anything, suggested they were wasting his time, and eventually refused to let them test drive a vehicle despite having valid licenses and insurance. The complaint had been filed, noted, and closed within a week with George Sterling's signature at the bottom and a comment that read, "Spoke with Richard. He was protecting dealership interests. Matter resolved." James felt sick reading it. This hadn't been a secret. People had spoken up and they'd been ignored. He found Monica's personnel file next. Outstanding performance reviews for her first 2 years. Then suddenly she was marked down for attitude problems and difficulty working with management, right after she'd filed her complaint about Richard. She'd been moved to administrative duties where she had no customer contact and no commission opportunities. Another employee, Andre, had left 6 months ago. His exit interview was buried in HR files, but James found it. Andre described an environment where certain customers were treated as not worth the effort based on appearance. He mentioned Richard by name multiple times, explaining how uncomfortable it made the younger salespeople who wanted to treat everyone fairly but felt pressured to follow their directors. James opened his laptop and started pulling sales comparison data. He created spreadsheets showing market demographics versus customer demographics at Prestige Auto Gallery. The gap was stunning. While the surrounding area had become increasingly diverse and prosperous, the dealership's customer base had actually become less diverse. He pulled up competitor data next. 3 other luxury dealerships in the area were thriving, showing steady growth year over year. Prestige Auto Gallery had been stagnant for the past 3 years. On paper, they were doing okay, but they should have been doing great. The market was there. The opportunity was there. They were just turning it away at the door. James calculated the lost revenue. Based on demographic trends and competitor performance, Prestige Auto Gallery had likely lost millions in potential sales over the past 5 years alone. Richard's prejudice had a price tag, and it was massive. By Sunday evening, James had built a complete case. File folders stacked on his desk, spreadsheets printed out, testimony documented. He had security footage from the upgraded camera system he'd had installed during the acquisition process. Footage that Richard didn't even know existed yet. Catherine came by his office Sunday night, bringing coffee and looking over his research. She whistled low when she saw the numbers. "This is even worse than I thought," she said, flipping through pages. "You've got grounds to terminate for cause, no severance, no nothing." "That's the minimum of what's happening," James replied. "But I want the staff to understand why. They need to see this, learn from it, know that this kind of behavior has consequences." He'd also spent part of the weekend reaching out to people. He called Patricia, the woman who'd complained 2 years ago about Richard's treatment of her and her son. She was shocked to hear from him, even more shocked to learn he was the new owner. He apologized on behalf of the dealership and meant every word. He called David Chen, the surgeon who'd been treated with suspicion. He called 3 other people who'd left negative reviews mentioning discriminatory treatment. Each conversation was difficult, hearing the hurt and frustration in their voices. But each person appreciated that someone was finally listening, finally taking their experience seriously. Monica was the last person he called on Sunday night. "I need you to come to the dealership tomorrow morning at 9, he told her. "Trust me on this. I don't work there anymore, remember? You might want to reconsider that," James said. "Things are about to change, significantly." Monday morning, James woke up early. He put on his best suit, the one he'd worn when he closed the deal to sell his tech company. He looked at himself in the mirror and took a deep breath. Today, Richard would learn that actions have consequences. Today, the staff at Prestige Auto Gallery would learn what kind of leader James intended to be. Today, everything would change. He grabbed his briefcase, called Catherine to confirm she'd meet him there, and headed out the door. The drive to the dealership felt longer than usual, anticipation building with every mile. Justice, James thought, doesn't always come quickly. But when it comes, it should be thorough. James pulled into the Prestige Auto Gallery parking lot at 8:45 Monday morning. Catherine was already there, leaning against her car with a leather portfolio under her arm. Next to her stood Helen, the dealership's head of human resources, looking nervous but determined. James had called her over the weekend too, filling her in on what was about to happen. "Ready for this?" Catherine asked as James approached. "More than ready," he replied. They walked through the front doors together. The morning sun streamed through the glass walls of the showroom, making the polished cars gleam. Several employees were already there, preparing for the day. James spotted Tom, the security guard, organizing some paperwork at the front desk. Their eyes met briefly, and Tom looked away quickly, probably remembering the uncomfortable task he'd been forced to do just days earlier. Richard stood near the back of the showroom, talking with two salespeople and gesturing animatedly. He was wearing another expensive suit, his confidence radiating across the room. He'd prepared a presentation for this morning, having been told there would be a meeting about the ownership transition. His laptop was set up on a table, ready to impress the new owner he'd never met. At exactly 9 o'clock, Helen sent out the message. All staff to the main showroom immediately for an important announcement. Employees filtered in from the service department, the offices, the back rooms. Within 5 minutes, about 30 people had gathered, forming a loose semicircle in the center of the showroom. Richard positioned himself at the front, assuming he'd be leading this meeting. He had his presentation ready to go, confident in his role as the senior leader who'd be introducing the new owner and explaining how things would continue running smoothly. Then James walked, and he moved through the crowd with Catherine and Helen flanking him. Most employees didn't recognize him at first. Why would they? He'd only been there once, and that visit had ended with him being escorted out. But Richard recognized him. James watched as the blood drained from Richard's face. His confident posture faltered, shoulders dropping slightly. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. For maybe the first time in 15 years, Richard was speechless. "Good morning, everyone," James said, his voice calm and clear. "My name is James Williams, and as of 3 weeks ago, I'm the new owner of Prestige Auto Gallery." The murmur that went through the crowd was immediate. Employees exchanged confused glances. Several looked toward Richard, whose face had gone from pale to red. Monica stood near the back, a knowing look in her eyes. She'd figured it out the moment she saw James walk in. "I know this is unexpected," James continued. "I chose to keep my identity private during the transition because I wanted to see how this business really operates. I wanted to understand the customer experience firsthand." He paused, letting that sink in. "And I definitely got that understanding." He gestured to Helen, who wheeled over a large monitor on a stand. With a few clicks, security footage began playing on the screen. Everyone watched in silence as the scene from last Friday unfolded. Richard approaching James, the dismissive conversation, the escalation, the call to security. Tom escorting James out while Richard stood there with his arms crossed, looking satisfied. The showroom was completely silent except for the audio from the video. Several employees shifted uncomfortably. A few looked down at their feet. Tom, standing near the back, had his hand over his face. When the video ended, James let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. "This isn't an isolated incident," he said. "Over the past week, I've reviewed years of customer complaints, employee testimonies, and sales data. What I found was a pattern of discrimination that's been allowed to continue for far too long. He nodded to Catherine, who began distributing printed documents to the assembled staff, copies of customer complaints, all with identifying information redacted, but the core stories intact. A mother and son turned away. A surgeon questioned and dismissed. A businessman denied service. Page after page of people who'd been judged not by their qualifications or intentions, but by their appearance. These complaints were filed over the past 5 years, James explained. Every single one was dismissed or ignored. And because of that, we've lost not just customers, but our reputation in the community. We've lost revenue. We've lost talented employees who couldn't stand to work in this environment anymore. He turned to face Richard directly. Richard, do you have anything to say? Richard's jaw worked as he struggled to find words. Finally, he spoke, his voice defensive. I was protecting the dealership. Anyone in this business knows you can't waste time on people who aren't serious buyers. My job is to maintain standards, to make sure we're serving clients who can actually afford what we're selling. And how exactly do you determine who can afford our vehicles? James asked. By looking at them? By the color of their skin? By making assumptions based on your own prejudices? That's not what I do, Richard protested, his voice rising. Look at my sales numbers. Look at my track record. I've been the top performer here for years. I've made this dealership profitable. James pulled out another set of documents. Actually, let's talk about those numbers. You're right that you've had strong sales, but let's compare your client base to our other successful salespeople. He held up a chart. Every other top performer here serves a diverse range of customers. Your client base is remarkably narrow, and while you've been maintaining your niche, the dealership as a whole has been losing market share. He put up another slide showing competitor analysis. The luxury car market in this area has grown by 18% over the past 3 years. Our sales have grown by 3%. We should be thriving, but we're barely treading water. And the demographic data shows exactly why. We're turning away qualified buyers because of attitudes like yours. Several employees were nodding now. A young salesman named Chris spoke up. I've seen this happen. I've watched qualified customers get ignored or dismissed, and I felt like I couldn't say anything because Richard is the boss. Monica stepped forward. I did say something. I filed a complaint 2 years ago after watching Richard turn away a customer who had pre-approved financing and was ready to buy. I got demoted for it. James looked at Monica. I know. I read your complaint, and I called you this weekend because I want to offer you a position as our new director of sales. The room erupted in surprised murmurs. Monica's eyes went wide. Richard looked like he'd been slapped. You can't do this, Richard said, his voice shaking now. Whether from anger or fear, James couldn't tell. I've given 15 years to this dealership. I've been loyal. I've produced results. Results built on discrimination, James said firmly. And loyalty means nothing when it comes at the expense of basic human dignity. Richard, your employment here is terminated effective immediately. Helen will escort you to collect your personal belongings. You'll receive information about your final paycheck and benefits, but there will be no severance package. This is termination for cause. Richard stood frozen for a moment, looking around as if expecting someone to come to his defense. No one did. The silence spoke volumes. Tom, James called out. The security guard stepped forward, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Please make sure Richard leaves the premises peacefully. As Richard was escorted away, his 15-year reign finally over, James turned back to the remaining staff. Some looked relieved. Others looked shocked. All of them were paying attention. This is day one of how things are going to be here, James said. Excellence, integrity, and respect for every person who walks through that door. No exceptions. The real work was about to begin. The weeks following Richard's departure were harder than James expected. Change always is. Some employees embraced the new direction immediately, relieved that someone had finally addressed the problems they'd witnessed. Others were skeptical, wondering if this was just talk or if real transformation would follow. Monica accepted the director of sales position, though she admitted to James privately that she was terrified. I've never managed a team this size, she told him during their first one-on-one meeting. And some of these people watched me get demoted. How am I supposed to lead them? The same way you had the courage to speak up when no one else would, James replied. With honesty and integrity. That's all I'm asking for. True to his word, James implemented immediate changes. He brought in a consultant to conduct diversity and inclusion training for the entire staff. Not the boring checkbox kind of training, but real conversations about bias, assumptions, and the business case for serving all customers equally. Some employees rolled their eyes at first, but by the end of the sessions, even the skeptics were engaged. James personally reached out to every customer who'd filed a complaint about discriminatory treatment over the past 5 years. These calls weren't easy. Some people were angry. Some had moved on and didn't want to revisit painful experiences. But several appreciated that someone was finally acknowledging what had happened to them. Patricia, the woman whose complaint about Richard had been dismissed 2 years earlier, actually cried on the phone. "I thought I was crazy," she said. "Everyone told me I was being too sensitive, that I'd misunderstood. Thank you for believing me." James invited her back to the dealership with her son, who was now in college. This time, Monica personally helped them explore options for upgrading his graduation car. They left with a fair deal and, more importantly, with their dignity intact. David Chen, the surgeon who'd been treated with suspicion, was harder to reach. His assistant initially screened James's calls, probably assuming it was a sales pitch. When James finally got through and explained who he was, David was quiet for a long moment. "I appreciate the call," David said carefully, "but I already bought a car from your competitor across town. They treated me like a valued customer from the moment I walked in." "I understand completely," James said, "and I'm sorry we lost your business. But I want you to know that things are different now, and if you ever need service or decide to shop with us in the future, we'd welcome the opportunity to earn your trust." It was a small gesture, but word travels in professional communities. Within weeks, several of David's colleagues visited the dealership. Curious about the changes they'd heard about, James also reached out to former employees who'd left because of the toxic environment. Andre, the young man who'd quit after witnessing Richard's behavior, was working at a competing dealership. James offered him his old job back with a promotion and better pay. "Why should I believe anything's different?" Andre asked during their coffee meeting. "Because I'm not asking you to believe it," James said. "I'm asking you to come see it for yourself. Give us 90 days. If the culture hasn't changed, you can leave with my blessing and a good reference." Andre came back. So did 2 other former employees who'd left under similar circumstances. Their return sent a powerful message to the remaining staff that this wasn't just temporary window dressing. The financial changes took longer to materialize, but they came. In the first month, sales actually dipped as the team adjusted to new leadership and policies. James didn't panic. He knew real transformation takes time. By the 3rd month, something shifted. New customers started coming in, many from communities that had previously avoided Prestige Auto Gallery. Word had spread through neighborhoods and social networks that things were different now. The staff, led by Monica's example, treated everyone who walked through the door with the same attention and respect. Chris, the young salesman who'd spoken up during the confrontation, closed a deal with a young entrepreneur who'd specifically sought out the dealership after hearing about the changes. "I wanted to support a business that's doing the right thing," the customer told him. 6 months after Richard's departure, Prestige Auto Gallery surpassed its previous sales records. The numbers told the story that James had known was possible all along. When you serve everyone, when you don't turn away qualified buyers based on prejudice, business grows. But the success wasn't just about money. Tom, the security guard who'd had to escort James out that first day, stopped by his office one afternoon. The older man looked emotional. "I just want to say thank you," Tom said quietly. "I've worked here for 8 years. I saw things that bothered me, but I didn't know what to do about it. I was afraid of losing my job if I spoke up. You gave us permission to be better." Stories like that reminded James why this mattered. It wasn't just about running a profitable business. It was about creating a place where people could work with dignity and where customers could shop without fear of judgment. A year after that humiliating Friday afternoon, James organized a community event at the dealership. He invited customers, employees, local business leaders, and community organizations. The showroom was transformed with food stations, live music, and families wandering through, kids climbing carefully into cars and pretending to drive. Patricia came with her son. David Chen stopped by with his wife. Andre brought his entire family. Monica stood near the entrance, greeting people with genuine warmth, completely comfortable in her role now. A local news station covered the event, interested in the dealership's transformation story. During the interview, the reporter asked James about the incident that started everything. "It was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life," James said honestly. "But it also showed me exactly what needed to change. Sometimes you can't fix what you can't see. I needed to experience that discrimination firsthand to understand how deep it ran." "Any regrets?" the reporter asked. James thought about that. "I regret that it took so long for someone to address these issues. I regret that customers were hurt and employees felt powerless. But I don't regret buying this dealership, and I don't regret how we've transformed it." As the evening wound down, James stood in the same spot where Richard had confronted him a year ago. The black sedan he'd been interested in that day was now parked prominently in the showroom, with a small plaque next to it that read, "Everyone deserves respect, dignity, and a chance to be heard." He'd eventually bought that car, but not for himself. He donated it to a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people get to job interviews and rebuild their lives. It felt like the right full circle moment. Monica walked over holding a glass of sparkling cider. "Pretty good turnout," she said, surveying the crowd. "Pretty good year," James replied. She smiled. "You know what the best part is? I actually love coming to work now." I think a lot of us feel that way. That, James thought, was worth more than any sales record. Change wasn't easy, and the work was never really finished. But standing there, watching a diverse crowd of happy customers and proud employees, he knew they were building something that would last. Sometimes justice takes time, sometimes transformation requires courage, and sometimes the most humiliating moments become the catalyst for the most meaningful change. James raised his glass toward the crowd, toward the future, toward the possibility of what comes when people choose to do better. The work continues,